well, wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's presentation entitled The Struggles of Boston's Black Workers in the Civil War Era. So author Jacqueline Jones is here to give a presentation based on her brand new book, No Right to an Honest Living, The Struggles of Boston's Black Workers in the Civil War Era. Jacqueline is the Ellen C. Temple Professor of Women's History, Emerita, at the University of Texas at Austin, and she's the past president of the American Historical Association. She's the winner of the Bancroft Prize for her book, Labor of Love, Labor of Sorrow, and she's a two-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and she lives nearby in Concord, Massachusetts. So again, want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library for their sponsorship, and all 50 of us that are watching live, and the 100 or so that will watch the recording. Let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jacqueline for joining us tonight. And Jacqueline, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks for that nice introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here tonight. Before I start, I just want to say that over the course of my career, I have spent a lot of time in libraries and archives, and I'm greatly indebted to many librarians and archivists. And parenthetically, I'll just mention that I met my husband at a card catalog. But tonight, I especially want to thank all librarians everywhere, professionals who are on the front lines of protecting our democracy. And I just wanted to say that as a historian and as a citizen, I think it's vital that we let librarians do their job. So again, thanks for inviting me here tonight. So I'm going to talk about the book, No Right to an Honest Living. And I took the title from a speech given by Dr. John S. Rock in Boston in 1860. Dr. Rock was born in 1825 in New Jersey. He was first trained as a dentist, then as a physician. He became a public lecturer and ended his career as an attorney. He was speaking on the 90th anniversary of the death of Crispus Attucks, arguably the first person to fall in conflict against the British in the lead up to the American Revolution. And Dr. Rock shocked his audience. They expected him to talk about Crispus Attucks, the martyring of Attucks, and instead he began to criticize white abolitionists in Boston, saying that they were not really good allies, not friends to people of color in the city. Colored men have no right to earn an honest living, said Rock. Their enemies believe that they must be starved out. So Boston has garnered a lot of attention from historians recently, those who are looking at African-American history. And those historians have looked at Boston and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts as very enlightened places in antebellum America. Black people in Boston and Massachusetts at large had the right to, men had the right to vote. The children had the right to attend integrated schools. There was a right to intermarriage. Black men were beginning to serve on juries. They could run for office. The state was beginning to guarantee the integration of entertainment and other kinds of venues. And Black men and women in Boston were very politically engaged during this period before the Civil War. They were very active abolitionists, active in a variety of reforms. But what I've noticed in all this literature, and it's excellent literature on the history of Boston before the Civil War, is that the subject of work is largely missing from these studies which focus on legal issues. And that's even though work was a central, everyday lived experience for Black people. It was a major focus of Black political struggle, even though work had profound implications for family life and wealth accumulation. And even though 19th century reformers seemed preoccupied by the whole issue of work. So my point here is that labor is central to any history of Boston during this period. Who did what, for what compensation, under what conditions. And my book focuses particularly on ways that Black men and women made a living during this period and the barriers they faced in that. So tonight I would like to talk about three themes, and also I hope introduce you to some interesting historical figures you might not have heard of before. But my themes focus first on the fact that Black people remain confined by and large to menial labor throughout the 19th century. They were doing essentially the same things in 1900 that they have been doing in 1840, even though the 19th century was a time of great upheaval with the New England Industrial Revolution, the American Civil War, and then after the Civil War, the emergence of a retail commercial economy. My second theme has to do with the fact that over their lifetimes, most Black people had to contend with menial labor because a number of groups of potential white allies failed to press for just working conditions and opportunities for Black people in private homes, businesses, city public works projects, and the US military. And I'll be talking about those allies, potential allies, in more detail in a minute. Third, I wanted to make the point that Black people showed tremendous creativity and resiliency, a great deal of resourcefulness in making a living and sustaining their families, at times in ways that weren't really documented in the census or in other official reports about the social division of labor. So we're going to be looking at some of those examples of creativity and making a living. So the narrative thread throughout the book is a group of formerly enslaved people, whom I call the Edlow 66. These were 66 men, women, and children who were the former slaves of Carter Edlow in Virginia. And when he died in 1844, Edlow freed his slaves by his will. However, these men, women, and children did not really see freedom until 3 years later in 1847, when many of them, I think there were 81 altogether, but 66 of them came to Boston in September of 1847. There were 25 men, 15 women, and 26 children. And each came with $14.96. Edlow had promised each of his former slaves $50 upon his death, but the executors of his estate rejected that demand in his will and instead gave each of these former slaves only a fraction of what they were entitled to by the will. And here we see the Reverend Peter Randolph. He was the leader of the group. He was originally a blacksmith and a literate man who became a tender when he arrived in Boston. That means an all-around janitor, porter, messenger, and after a few years, though, in the city, he became a Baptist minister. But it's an interesting story because Peter Randolph eventually sued the descendants of Carter Edlow for the remaining funds due him and the other Edlow 66. And spoiler alert, he did. His suit was successful in 1855. But I look at several of these Edlow 66, including Peter Randolph and Thomas Selden and his father, Carter Selden. So this is a quotation from Samuel May Jr., who was an associate of William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist in Boston. And Samuel May is saying, you know, the Edlow 66 present an experiment of sorts, whether formerly enslaved people can take care of themselves. And he says, you know, this group of people is very different from the fugitives that have flooded into Boston. Boston was a magnet for fugitives from the South. You know, Samuel May was thinking of men and women like Frederick Douglass, Ellen and William Craft, Harriet Jacobs, Henry Box Brown. These are all fugitives who were ingenious in finding their way north. And Samuel May is saying, well, they're a special subset of enslaved people because they've had the ingenuity and the resourcefulness to find their way north by disguising themselves, forging papers, and so forth. In contrast, the Edlow 66 are representative of the enslaved population, according to Samuel May. So just a reminder here about 19th century Boston before I discuss it in detail. It was a seaport city, first and foremost, and it had many Irish immigrants, especially after the mid-1840s. So those two facts about Boston are certainly going to shape the life of the city and the work of people of color. So most Black women during this period worked as laundresses or as servants, and the men, by and large, worked as hawkers or peddlers or porters or servants or tenders, this kind of all-around catch-all category. Many men and women took jobs piecemeal. They did not have long-standing or stable jobs, and they had to look for jobs from place to place. And here we have a street scene from Boston in the mid-19th century, and it's evocative because many Black workers are going to literally have to go from door to door among these shopkeepers and merchants in downtown Boston and ask for work on a daily basis. And I was able to trace this process through the story of a particular fugitive, Anthony Burns, who escaped from Richmond in 1854, came to Boston, and right away made a connection with a man named William Jones, a Black man, who showed Burns around, and they went from a dancing master to a hotel to a clothing store. Their first day, this kind of wending their way through the city, asking for work for an hour, 2 hours, for maybe a day, or something like that. So that was the lot of the vast majority of Black workers, especially Black men. This casual labor, very low paid, picking up jobs whenever and wherever they could on the basis of who they knew and how resourceful they could be, how ambitious they could be in going from place to place. Now, I wanted to say a little more about this issue of white allies. And we have here a quote from the famous writer, activist, fugitive Frederick Douglass. And he, like John S. Rock, is making the point that abolitionists care more really for the suffering enslaved of the South than they do for their Black neighbors in Boston. And also, he says, even those with anti-slavery sympathies won't hire Black people because, first of all, their white employees won't stand for it. And secondly, they say their white customers won't patronize their businesses if they have Black employees. And Douglass says, everything is seemingly against us. We must do something for ourselves. So I think we want to, first of all, really step back and make note of the fact that white abolitionists were courageous. They were in a distinct minority in Boston during this period. They put up with a lot of ridicule and much worse. William Lloyd Garrison was attacked, physically dragged through the streets of Boston by angry pro-slavery mobs. So we have to realize how courageous and brave these men and women were. At the same time, their focus was on the South during this period, and they seemed indifferent and really oblivious to the struggles of Black men and women in their own city. So another group we might have expected to be allies were Republicans. The Republican Party was founded in 1854 as an anti-slavery party. And that's where the abolitionists, almost all of them, found a political home. And after the war, the Republicans, of course, were much different from the Southern Democrats. The Democrats, the party of secession, the party of the Confederates. But the Republicans, too, are very worried about their white constituents, and they do not really press for integrated work sites or for economic justice for Black people. I put Lewis Hayden here. He was a fugitive from Kentucky. He was exceptional because the Republicans appointed him a messenger of the Massachusetts Secretary of State in 1858, a job he held until his death. But he was the exception that proved the rule. Very few Black men got such positions, and in general, white Republicans did not seem overly concerned about the barriers to full employment suffered by Black men and women during this period. Another group that we might have thought would have been allies of Black workers were labor leaders during this period. And I just wanted to mention Boston had several really famous labor leaders, reformers. Iris Stewart was in the vanguard of the 8-hour day. You know, most workers in this period are working 12, 14 hours a day, especially those who were machine workers. And also Frank Keyes Foster was a Massachusetts native and the leader of the Knights of Labor. And with Samuel Gompers, he helped to found the American Federation of Labor in 1886 and served as the president of the Massachusetts chapter of the AFL. But again, these labor leaders showed very little interest in Black workers. Black workers were a tiny percentage of the labor force. Most of the labor leaders during this period are really focused on factory workers, especially in the Boston hinterland, those textile mills of Lowell and Lawrence and throughout Rhode Island. I just wanted to mention a couple of women labor reformers. One was Jenny Collins, who wrote about factory work and domestic service. She wrote a book called Nature's Aristocracy, A Plea for the Oppressed in 1871, where she really lit into the job of domestic service. She said this was a humiliating kind of work. the pay was low, the hours were long. The employer, the mistress of the house, was usually an arrogant, mean-spirited, penny-pinching woman. So she said, it's incumbent on women to find better jobs, maybe as clerks in retail stores, anything to get out of domestic service. And I'll just mention, too, that Louisa May Alcott, the famous writer of Little Women, wrote a novel in 1871 called Work, which made essentially the same point that Jenny Collins had made about the daily humiliations of domestic service, and how any self-respecting woman would try to avoid that kind of work if at all possible. So while these women, these labor reformers, are writing about the degradation of domestic service, hundreds and hundreds of formerly enslaved people are coming to Boston as refugees after the Civil War. And I include here a register of people coming from Virginia to Boston, 1866 to 1867. And if you can read this, you can see there that Eliza Meeks, age 43, had come with her 8 children. And all of these migrants are funneled into positions of domestic service. So the idea seems to be that domestic service is no job for a white woman, but Black women and children, boys and girls, are willing and able to take this kind of job. So labor leaders, again, not writing about Black workers, not seeming to show much interest in their fate at all. Another group that might have been allies of Black workers were city officials, who employed large numbers of men in the parks, on the city streets, in construction projects. This image is from 1859, when much sand, gravel, soil was brought in from Needham to fill in what is called the Back Bay of Boston, which was a marsh at that time. And we see in the background, if you can see it, there is a train bringing carloads of fill for this project, and these men with their wagons are dumping the sand where very poor people are going through it looking for any kind of trash they could find and maybe repurpose or sell. But the point is here that the city, especially during and after the Civil War, employed thousands of men every year on city works projects. And those projects were limited to white men exclusively, well through the 19th century. We might have expected military officials to have appreciated the sacrifices made by Black soldiers in the Civil War. About 180,000 Black men served as soldiers or sailors. Here is Dr. John V. DeGrasse, who served as a surgeon in the Massachusetts 55th Regiment. But again, after the war, white veterans segregated their veterans groups and even met with their former Confederate enemies without paying much attention to the struggles of Black veterans during this period after the Civil War. And it's worth noting, of course, that Black men during the war had received lesser pay, $7 a month, compared to white men's $13 a month. That was true for most of the war, really, until July of 1864. So the lesser pay, a source of great aggravation and outrage among Black soldiers during this period. And finally, and I'm sorry, this is a little blurry. Finally, we might have expected academics and settlement workers in late 19th century Boston to have recognized the barriers that Black workers faced. This is a book written in 1914 by John Daniels. It's In Freedom's Birthplace, a history of Boston Blacks, and it's based on data from the year 1900. But from this book, we can tell that academics and settlement workers are really justifying a very unequal social division of labor, making excuses for employers who will not hire Black people, suggesting there is something inherent about Black people that makes them unsuitable for factory work or machine operatives. So again, this group, academics, settlement workers, are not allies of Black workers at all, and in fact seem to justify their continued oppression. A focus on work alter our way of looking at very familiar themes in history. And I just wanted to go through several themes that have to do with work, and I think really shed a very interesting light on some of these traditional issues. So for one, what I call a fugitive economy. Boston, as I said, was a magnet for runaways from the South, freedom seekers. Here is Elizabeth Blakely, who escaped from Wilmington, North Carolina, and endured a 4-week journey of hiding aboard a ship. My point here is that a lot of people made money off the fugitives' despair. There were people in the South who took money to forge papers or get fugitives aboard ship. There were men aboard ship who took money so that they wouldn't reveal the hiding places of these fugitives. Ship captains often took money as well. So there were a variety of brokers that many fugitives had to rely upon in this process. And in another way that the fugitive economy worked, fugitive assistants in Boston could make some money, not a lot, but some, sheltering, feeding, caring for these fugitives, some of whom would remain in Boston and settle down there, and others would move on to Canada. So this is a list of some famous people. In fact, William Coopernell, Samuel May Jr., Lewis Hayden, who received money for caring for fugitives. Alice C. Green seemed to get aid. She was boarded by someone. Someone else paid for a nurse for her and provided other services. So this was a way that some Black people could make money. Again, very little. Peter Randolph was a fugitive assistant, but it reminds us of the way that money changed hands because of this fugitive economy. So looking at the different ways people could make money. So Harriet Hayden, I don't think she made any money. She was the wife of Lewis Hayden. They had escaped from Kentucky together. But she and her husband ran a boarding house where they lodged secretly, for the most part clandestinely, fugitives. And at one point, there were 13 fugitives in their home on the west side of Beacon Hill, and that was crowded, and she was the one, of course, doing the laundry and the cooking. So a reminder of the role of women in fugitive assistance, and especially taking care of these everyday jobs for men and women who have fled from slavery. I showed this slide before, but I just want to draw your attention to the fact that Frederick Douglass was implicitly criticizing William Lloyd Garrison here for not caring more about Black workers in Boston. And, you know, many historians have written about the clash between Douglass and Garrison because of political differences. Douglass wanting to be fully engaged in the political system, Garrison saying no, it was too corrupt to be part of. But here again is another issue that divided these two men, with Frederick Douglass really criticizing Garrison and other abolitionists at the time. So it is an interesting sidelight, I think, to the history of abolitionism during this time. I also, in the book, look at the hardships endured by Black activists during this period, and here are two very famous abolitionists, Charles Lennox Remond and his sister, Sarah Parker Remond. They were from Salem, Massachusetts, but they spent a lot of time in Boston. And they were both, especially Charles, were both very active speakers, public speakers, and would go off for weeks at a time to speak to audiences throughout New England, raising money for the abolitionist cause. And they received a small stipend and their travel expenses, and often did not get paid in a timely manner, meaning that family members at home suffered as a result. And that was particularly true for Charles, who did have a family back in Salem. So a reminder here of not only the eloquence and the courageousness of these Black abolitionists, but also the economic difficulties that they faced when they devoted full time to activism like this. So another really interesting topic, I think, is the performative nature of white supremacy in Boston at this time. And here we have a street scene, and you can tell how lively things are. There's an organ grinder with his monkey entertaining. Women are in their finery, promenading through the streets. There's a carriage driver who's driving much too fast. The streets were places of spectacle and performance, as well as places of work. And again, with so many Black workers going from place to place, they did spend a lot of time on the streets and encountered all sorts of resistance and taunts as a result. So I do look too at what I call the underground commons. And these were multiracial workspaces. This is a rat pit where the men are betting on how many rats this poor little dog can kill in a specific amount of time. I looked at the man who collected rats for the rat pits. His name was Jum, and he was very talented in going into stables and being able to scoop up rats into a burlap bag. He was accosted by a police officer one night who wanted to know what was in the bag. And he put the bag down, and the officer could see that it was squirming. And Jum was very proud because he had captured, he thought, $5 worth of rats that night, which was quite a haul. So a really a way of making a living that was not going to show up in the census report or in the city directory, certainly. I also consider this dance hall operator, Joseph F. Clash, who owned a dance hall in the North End. He called it the American Hall. And he gave balls all the time. He was a talented musician. He employed cooks and other musicians. He had women come who would dance with men and for a nickel. And he was also a pimp. He was a con man, eager to fleece men in from the countryside. And he was card sharp. He was a very violent man, but very entrepreneurial at the same time. An employer, again, of musicians, cooks, prostitutes, dance hall girls, but fascinating person. And again, the dance hall, a multiracial space, Black and white men and women were there. I found a very interesting newspaper article where a reporter went to the American Hall in company with a police officer. And they both enjoyed themselves that night. The food was excellent. They enjoyed the music. And Joseph Clash, as I said, was very violent, but whenever he was on trial, and he was several times for assault and for murder, he was acquitted because the jurors knew him and many of them had patronized his establishment. So just a reminder that Boston was full of sex workers. It was a seaport city, card sharps, scam artists, and pickpockets and pickpocketresses, women who were pickpockets too during this period. So I think we have to file these kinds of people not only under criminals, but under workers as well. They were trying to make a living. It was not an honest living, certainly, but they were trying to make a living in these ways. So yes, and there was a great deal of creativity involved here. And one group I do discuss in some detail is the fugitive imposter. And that is the man or woman who claims to be an escaped slave, but isn't, was born free in the North, but tries to trick well-intentioned people into giving him or her money so that they can redeem their family still in the South. So these fugitive imposters were very talented. They had to have a good story. They had to be good performers. They had to play on the sympathies of Black and white abolitionists. And some of them made a living. And it wasn't a very stable kind of living. They had to take off and go to another town before they were found out or caught by the police. But an interesting category of worker, I think. And I do look at some very, or at least relatively well-to-do workers in Boston during this period. And I just wanted to mention a few of them. Joshua Bowen Smith, caterer who really put on lavish banquets for the Boston City Council, for Harvard faculty. He was well known throughout the area for his catering. Robert Morris was an attorney and had both Black and white clients, very successful attorney during these years, outspoken politician as well. Louise de Morty was an elocutionist. She could recite from memory poetry and long passages from popular writers. She gave readings often. And Christiana Madame Carteau Bannister, originally from Rhode Island, called herself a hair doctress, was a hairdresser. And the interesting thing about these well-to-do people is that they did well to the extent that they had white customers. Joshua Bowen Smith, for instance, Robert Morris, in particular, had had a white clientele that helped to keep them in business. And Louise de Morty spoke to white audiences as well. So just a note here about, again, the burdens placed on women, especially the wives of abolitionists. Anna Douglas, the wife of Frederick Douglass, who kept the family together while he was off in Europe and other parts of the country for months and even years at a time. Her burdens were really substantial, and they were not unique to her as well. Military service, just a reminder that we can look at soldiering as a kind of job. This is Lieutenant James M. Trotter, the father of William Monroe Trotter, a famous Boston journalist and activist. We should look at military service. We should look at the pay men got, the working conditions, their supervisors, whether they were eligible for promotions, the conditions under which they labored, their workplace culture. In other words, we can apply kind of those civilian metrics for work to the military encampment or the naval vessel in order to analyze Black men's economic well-being and opportunity in the military. And of course, many Black soldiers, in addition to fighting in a number of very bloody battles, Fort Pillow, Fort Wagner, Honey Hill, were also fatigue workers. And these are actually formerly enslaved men who were also enlisted as fatigue workers by the U.S. military in the South. But many Black soldiers wanting to shoulder the musket found themselves shouldering the hoe or the axe. And in some cases, even putting up the tents for white regiments and otherwise serving white soldiers. So, and in the process, their families at home were suffering because these men, the men of the 54th and the 55th Massachusetts regiments, the Black regiments, did not accept lesser pay for many, many months as a matter of principle. And so their families at home suffered accordingly. And also I look at those Black men and women from Boston who went south after the Civil War, and in some cases during the Civil War, to work among the freed people. This is Harriet Jacobs on the right. She's the famous author of the book Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. She was a fugitive from North Carolina. And on the left is her daughter, Louisa M. Jacobs. And mother and daughter set up schools for Black children in Alexandria, Virginia. And then they also went after the war to Savannah, Georgia. And one of the motivating factors was that both of them would otherwise have been working as domestic servants in Boston. And both of them found that kind of work enervating and exhausting. So certainly the Lure of the South was there to help the suffering freed people, but they were also fleeing a very difficult work situation in the city of Boston. And then, as I mentioned before, the failure of the Republican Party in the post-Civil War era. George L. Ruffin, his family had moved from Virginia in the 1850s to Boston. His family was free. He was the first graduate of Harvard, Black graduate of Harvard Law School. He was one of the first Black judges in Massachusetts. He served in the state legislature. But again, he, like Lewis Hayden, was the exception that proved the rule. He received jobs in the Customs House and the Postal Service, but he never got the kinds of promotions that his white counterparts were getting. I do follow a number of preachers very closely, including Leonard Grimes and his wife, Octavia Grimes. Leonard was the pastor of the 12th Baptist Church, often called the Fugitives Church in Boston, and a very active anti-slavery person in the city. The interesting thing about preachers, they had a lot of status in the Black community, but they were often impoverished because they depended on the well-being of their congregants. And many of these congregants were very poor. Leonard Grimes, his wife, really throwing themselves on the mercy of their congregants who would take up charitable collections for them every once in a while to help them with their family and their household expenses. So very interesting to look at preachers, and again, remind ourselves that a high status did not necessarily in this period mean a high income. And unusual kinds of workers. Deacon Cyrus Foster was born in 1785 in Chelmsford, Massachusetts. He was a servant, a valet, but he was also an entertainer and gave an annual concert in Boston where he would enlist a musical group or a choral group. And he would also expound on some question of the day, which and white people found his ruminations very amusing. But you know, they sometimes refer to him as a fool. But you know, when you wonder who was the fool when you think of how many white people paid good money to make Cyrus Foster a very well-to-do person. He gave these concerts annually. He would parade through the streets the day before, get a lot of attention, get his name in the paper, and these were very popular affairs that he put on. And a final point I look at is coping strategies among very poor families. You know, we wonder how these families stayed together. The women and the men had to work, and often adult children remained in the household, even when into their 20s, 30s, to help with expenses. The families relied on mutual aid societies, on fraternal orders for help at times. So there were really very interesting strategies that helped these families survive during this period. So I just want to conclude by saying that, again, Boston's social division of labor in 1900 was about what it was in 1840. This is from the John Daniels book, In Freedom's Birthplace. And if we look at the large categories here of Black men, he's looking at about 4,500 male workers in 1900. The large categories are laborers, porters and helpers in stores, and then we look over here as well to teamsters and the janitors and sextons. And missing from these charts are substantial numbers of people in the skilled trades, in factory work, in white-collar work such as bookkeeping, teaching, or other professions. And again, the women serving mostly as laundresses and servants. So before I do conclude, I wanted to just have you look for a moment at this quotation from a Congregational clergyman, Charles L. Woodworth, in Boston in 1867. And it's a really powerful statement. And I will note that Woodworth was white, and he's saying the whole country owes its prosperity to enslaved people. The people who picked the cotton and fueled the textile mills of New England, the planters who were customers of New England craftsmen who made plows and harnesses for horses. He's suggesting here that there is a tremendous debt that the country owes enslaved people who receive no compensation for their labor at all. And it's a reminder too of how much the city of Boston really relied upon the cotton economy during this period. The ship captains who took fish and lumber south and brought materials north, the textile mill owners in Lawrence and Lowell who relied on the raw cotton grown by enslaved people, the creditors, the bankers, the merchants who were lending money to Southern planters and making a profit off of that. In many, many ways, the cotton economy was the fuel, the engine for Northern prosperity. And C.L. Woodworth is saying, what does the country now owe the men and women who worked, again, without compensation, without pay, and enriched all the rest of us in the process? So I hope that you agree with me that a study of the ways of making a living is a particularly rich topic. and covers virtually every aspect of Black family and community life in Boston during this period. The Civil War was a traumatic event. It claimed the lives of an estimated 750,000 people, but it did not affect the racial division of labor in Boston. This separate, low-wage division of labor was not a natural historical process, but the product of decisions among many groups of ordinary white men and women in concert with white employers, clergy, and political leaders. In spite of barriers to economic justice, though, Black men and women showed resilience and resourcefulness in creating their own jobs and pooling their resources as members of extended kin groups, churches, mutual aid societies, and fraternal orders, and the Black community as a whole. And I think we should remember and honor their struggles, not only as freedom fighters, but as workers as well. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions that we might have in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jacqueline, thank you so much. A wonderful job as expected. And folks, we have about 5 or 10 minutes for questions. So if you have any questions, please get them into the Q&A and into the chat. Patricia writes, it's so important to learn more about history through the lives of real people. Thank you for all that you do. And Jacqueline, one question that was sent to me directly, wondering, can you talk a bit about the research that you did to write your book?
Yes, well, in a sense, this was a COVID book, and I relied on a lot of different kinds of sources. And in fact, you know, I have a lot of databases that I use, databases of historic newspapers. I often say if I were marooned on a desert island with only one database, it would be ancestry.com because that has a lot of census material, has a lot of wonderful information. So I made good use of those online resources, and I found that many area archives were happy to make copies of materials that I requested as well. So yeah, the Freedmen's Bureau archives were really essential here, were fascinating. And again, you know, I think reading newspapers gave me a good sense of these ordinary people and what they were going through. I looked at the police court records, you know, to see what people were charged with. And just one interesting thing about it is the police every once in a while conduct what they called a descent on the North End, you know, this area of vice and so forth. And they would round up all the prostitutes that they could, and then most of them paid a fine, or they had the brothel owner pay a fine, and they were back on the streets the next day. But you know, you get those kinds of stories from police court records that are often in the newspapers as well. So yeah.
And Jacqueline, I don't think you touched on this, but why did you go about writing this book? You know, what about the topic interests you? And, you know, why did you want so many people to know about it?
Well, I had written a book earlier called Saving Savannah, the City and the Civil War, where I looked at the city of Savannah before the war, during the war, and after the war. And, you know, many historians look at the antebellum period and then they stop when the war starts. And then many people will look at the postbellum period, start in 1865 after the war is over. And I wanted to look at kind of the full sweep of this period before, during, and after the war, and see what happened to people as a result of this tremendous conflagration. So, and I felt, you know, that Boston as the center of radical abolitionism was a really interesting place to study. Obviously, a lot of very famous people lived and worked here, but I was surprised, you know, when I found the John Rock quote and then began to investigate the fact that even these fervent abolitionists, white abolitionists, were indifferent to Black folks in Boston at the time.
Michelle says, thank you. This was a very informative presentation. An anonymous attendee asked, has much or has anything been done on blacks who successfully passed as white? So, and perhaps they're talking about research or books written, but has much or anything been done about blacks who successfully passed as white?
Yes, there is a whole literature on that. I'm sorry, I can't rattle the titles of those books off the top of my head, but yes, certainly the case. And I will say that, several of the people I featured tonight were the children of white men, their owners under slavery. Harriet Jacobs, for instance, there were quite a few. So, and Louisa Jacobs, Harriet's daughter, looked white, but she identified as black and so was treated as a black woman. But yes, there is historical literature on people who had black parentage but could pass for white.
Jane says, thank you. I learned a great deal from tonight's presentation. And as we approach 8 o'clock, we'll start to wind it down. Folks, so I'll send a recording tomorrow along with the feedback survey and information about some other upcoming Black History Month virtual lectures. Tomorrow night, you have two options. So tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, we're being joined by Emily Levine, who is the program manager at the Longfellow House / Washington's headquarters, National Historic Site. And she'll be talking about George Washington's Revolutionary War headquarters and his treatment of African Americans. So that'll be tomorrow night, Wednesday, February 8th at 7 o'clock. And in addition to Black History Month, hey, we're also celebrating Valentine's Day. And tomorrow we'll have a lecture at 7 o'clock on the history of chocolate in Massachusetts. And that talk is from Victoria Kitchik, who is a chocolate sommelier. Didn't even know that existed. And she's also a writer and a tour guide. She previously worked for Lindt Chocolate, and she co-organizes the New England Chocolate Festival. All right, so two great virtual programs coming at you tomorrow night. Let me go back to you, Jacqueline. Any last words before we wrap up? And Jacqueline, where can people buy copies of your book if they're interested?
Well, they can go on Amazon. I think a lot of Boston area bookstores have the book too, but yeah.
Yeah, great. And so Jacqueline, thank you so much for joining us tonight and being so generous with your time and educating us on a topic I didn't really know too much about myself. And so we'll give you a big virtual round of applause one last time. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening. And I guess there's snow on the way. So not a lot of snow, but a little bit of snow anyway. So everyone have a safe evening and look for that email tomorrow morning. So thank you all and have a great night. Thanks, Jacqueline.
Thanks, and thank you, librarians. Thanks to the librarians who are out there.
Yeah, very nice comments at the beginning. I appreciated that, Jacqueline. And yes, I'm glad you're a big fan of librarians. We're a big fan of historians and authors who write books. So thank you. Good. Right back at you.
Thanks.
All right, have a good one, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.